$2,000 for that pile of broken dreams? You have got to be kidding. A man laughed loudly from the back of the crowded auction hall, and the room quickly filled with more laughter as dozens of curious faces turned toward Ethan Carter, a 39-year-old white American mechanic whose faded blue work shirt carried more oil stains than anyone else in the building. Ethan did not answer. He simply lifted the small bidding card one final time, his calm eyes never leaving the auctioneer. Beside him, 8-year-old Liam Carter looked up with complete confidence instead of uncertainty, as though his father had just purchased the greatest treasure in town instead of an abandoned garage everyone else had forgotten. The auctioneer struck the wooden gavel against the podium. Sold. Garage number 18. $2,000. Another wave of quiet chuckles swept across the room while people gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. Someone muttered that the old mechanic had just wasted every dollar he had managed to save. Another joked that the building would probably collapse before the month ended. Ethan simply folded the purchase papers and placed them carefully inside a weathered envelope. He rested his hand gently on Liam's shoulder before saying, "Come on, buddy. We have work to do." Outside, the cool Pennsylvania afternoon carried the familiar scent of autumn leaves mixed with distant engine exhaust as father and son climbed into an aging pickup truck that had seen better years. The truck started on the second attempt, just as it usually did, and Ethan smiled faintly instead of complaining. Liam looked across the worn dashboard. "Dad, do you really think there is something special inside that garage?" Ethan glanced toward the road before answering. "Sometimes people walk away from things because they only see what is broken. I make a living by looking for what can still be repaired." Liam smiled quietly, accepting the answer without another question. Several miles away, high above downtown Pittsburgh inside the executive offices of Bennett Motors, Victoria Bennett stood alone beside a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city skyline. At 35 years old, she had become one of the youngest billionaire chief executive officers in the automotive industry. Yet her attention rested not on financial reports spread across her polished walnut desk, but on an old yellowed envelope that had arrived unexpectedly that morning. Inside rested a faded photograph of a small brick garage with a barely visible metal number hanging above the entrance. Attached to the photograph was a handwritten note from an attorney who had recently uncovered forgotten documents during the final settlement of a decades-old estate dispute. One sentence immediately captured her attention. "The property has finally been released for public auction after 12 years of legal proceedings." Victoria's heartbeat slowed. For nearly 12 years, she had searched for every building connected to her late grandfather, the brilliant founder of Bennett Motors, believing one final piece of his legacy had disappeared before his death. Every search had ended with missing records, conflicting ownership files, and unanswered questions. She immediately reached for her phone. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," she instructed her assistant with unusual urgency. "Find out everything you can about garage number 18. Minutes later, the answer arrived. The property had already been sold earlier that afternoon. Victoria stared silently at the buyer's name appearing on her computer screen. Ethan Carter. Not an investor. Not a developer. Not a corporation. Just a mechanic from a small town. For the first time in years, something she believed belonged only to her family's history had quietly slipped into the hands of a man who had never even heard her grandfather's name. While several miles away, Ethan parked beside the weathered brick building, unlocked the rusted chain across the faded garage door, and watched golden evening sunlight spill through the widening opening onto decades of dust, forgotten tools, in a silence that somehow felt as though it had been patiently waiting for exactly this moment. The following morning arrived with a quiet layer of mist drifting across the empty parking lot as Ethan Carter unlocked the weathered garage door for the first full day of work inside the forgotten building. The old metal hinges groaned softly before warm morning sunlight slipped through the widening opening, revealing decades of dust floating peacefully through the air like tiny memories refusing to disappear. Liam stepped inside beside his father with a small broom almost as tall as he was. He looked around at shelves lined with rusted tools, faded cabinets, cracked concrete, and workbenches that had not welcomed a mechanic in many years. Instead of disappointment, his young face filled with excitement. "Where do we start?" he asked. Ethan smiled while setting an old toolbox onto the nearest bench. "We start with one corner. Every good repair begins with one small step." Father and son worked side by side throughout the morning. Liam carefully swept away dirt while Ethan examined damaged wiring, leaking pipes, and worn support beams. Every few minutes, Ethan paused to admire the craftsmanship hidden beneath years of neglect. Whoever had built the garage believed in doing things correctly the first time. Thick wooden beams remained remarkably straight. Steel brackets had been installed with unusual precision. Even the oldest workbench showed careful attention to detail. Ethan quietly nodded to himself. Somebody loved this place. Around noon, the sound of tires crunching across loose gravel interrupted the peaceful rhythm of sweeping and hammering. A dark blue sport utility vehicle rolled slowly into the parking lot before stopping several yards from the entrance. A well-dressed woman stepped out wearing simple casual clothing beneath a light jacket. Her elegant appearance softened enough that almost anyone would mistake her for an ordinary visitor instead of one of the wealthiest business leaders in America. Victoria Bennett paused for a brief moment before walking toward the open garage with a polite smile. She studied Ethan without introducing herself. The man standing before her looked exactly as the records had described. Calm, humble, focused entirely upon his work instead of the stranger approaching him. "Good afternoon," she said warmly. "I heard someone finally bought this old garage." Ethan wiped his hands with a clean shop towel before returning the smile. "That would be me." Victoria glanced around the building with careful curiosity. "Would you ever consider selling it?" Ethan looked at Liam, who continued organizing old tools with complete concentration before answering. "I only bought it yesterday." Victoria nodded gently. "Suppose someone offered you $20,000 today." Ethan almost laughed, not because the offer sounded foolish, but because it arrived far sooner than he expected. "That is very generous," he replied politely. "But I did not buy this place to flip it." Victoria watched his expression carefully. There was no greed, no excitement, no hesitation. She increased the offer without changing her calm voice. "What about $50,000? Liam finally looked up from the toolbox, his eyes growing wide, but Ethan remained remarkably peaceful. "Money solves many problems," he answered quietly, "but it cannot replace a dream once you sell it." Victoria folded her arms thoughtfully. She had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with some of the toughest executives in the country, yet this mechanic answered every question with quiet confidence instead of emotion. After several silent seconds, she spoke once more. $100,000. Even the birds outside seemed to grow still for a brief moment. Ethan slowly shook his head. "I appreciate your kindness, ma'am, but this garage already belongs somewhere." Victoria looked genuinely confused. "Where?" Ethan smiled toward Liam, who had just finished arranging several old wrenches by size with enormous pride. "His future." Victoria followed Ethan's gaze and remained silent. For the first time in many years, she met someone whose decisions could not be measured by market value, and as she prepared to leave, neither of them noticed Liam tapping lightly against one section of the old brick wall with the wooden handle of a broom. Every tap echoed with a solid sound until one final strike produced a hollow tone unlike every brick surrounding it, causing the young boy to stop, tilt his head, and quietly whisper to himself, "Dad, I think there is something behind this wall." The hollow sound lingered in the quiet garage long after Liam lowered the wooden broom handle. Ethan stopped sorting a tray of old sockets and looked toward his son with mild curiosity instead of excitement. "What did you find, buddy?" Liam tapped the same section of brick once more. The first tap echoed with a familiar solid tone. The second sounded exactly the same. Then he shifted only a few inches to the left and tapped again. A deep, empty echo answered from somewhere behind the wall. Ethan slowly walked over and repeated the test with the handle of a heavy screwdriver. His experienced ears immediately recognized the difference. Mechanics spent their lives listening for sounds other people ignored, and this wall was telling a story. He brushed decades of dust away with an old rag until the faded outline of several bricks appeared slightly different from the rest. The mortar surrounding them looked newer, as though someone had carefully sealed an opening many years earlier. Ethan knelt quietly, running his fingers across the uneven surface. "This was not an accident," he said softly. "Someone wanted this hidden." Liam's eyes widened with excitement. "Do you think there is treasure?" Ethan smiled without taking his eyes off the wall. Sometimes history is worth more than treasure. The afternoon sunlight drifted slowly across the concrete floor, while father and son carefully removed loose bricks one at a time, making certain not to damage whatever might be concealed behind them. Every brick revealed another, until a narrow opening finally appeared large enough for Ethan to shine a flashlight inside. Instead of another storage room, the bright beam disappeared into darkness beyond a thick steel door coated with years of dust, but almost no rust. That detail immediately caught Ethan's attention. Despite decades of neglect, the steel remained remarkably well preserved. Someone had built this entrance to last. Mounted at the center of the door rested a beautifully crafted bronze emblem shaped like the letter B, surrounded by finely engraved mechanical gears. Ethan gently brushed away another layer of dust. Whoever owned this garage took incredible pride in their work. Liam leaned closer, studying the unusual symbol. "Have you ever seen that before?" Ethan slowly shook his head. "No, but somebody wanted this place remembered." Several miles away, Victoria Bennett sat alone in her office, studying digital copies of century-old engineering records spread across two large computer screens. A message from the family attorney arrived moments later, containing another forgotten document recovered from the final estate files. As her eyes moved across each line, memories she had almost abandoned suddenly became clear. 12 years earlier, shortly after her grandfather's final business holdings entered probate court, one small property had disappeared into a complicated ownership dispute involving missing signatures, outdated land records, and overlapping legal claims. By the time every disagreement had finally been resolved, the garage had quietly slipped into a county auction before anyone connected to the Bennett family received notice. Victoria closed her eyes for a long moment. The garage had never truly been lost. It had simply been trapped inside paperwork that no one thought important enough to examine until it was too late. She immediately instructed her driver to prepare the car once again. Back inside the garage, Ethan examined the heavy steel door more carefully. There was no ordinary handle, only a circular brass plate fitted perfectly into the center beneath the bronze emblem. It appeared designed to open only with a matching mechanism that was nowhere to be found. He stepped back thoughtfully instead of forcing anything. "Some doors," he quietly told Liam, "are opened with patience before they are opened with strength." Liam nodded, still staring at the mysterious entrance. Then, as Ethan gathered the loose bricks into careful stacks, something small rolled quietly from the empty space beneath the lowest stone, catching the last rays of afternoon sunlight. It was a polished brass key unlike any either of them had ever seen, its handle engraved with the same elegant letter B that rested silently upon the hidden door. The polished brass key rested quietly in Ethan Carter's hand as the final light of the afternoon reflected across its carefully engraved surface. He turned it slowly between his fingers, admiring the remarkable craftsmanship that had survived decades hidden beneath old bricks and forgotten dust. Liam stood beside him with growing excitement. "Do you think it opens the door?" Ethan smiled gently. "There's only one honest way to find out." Together they approached the heavy steel entrance concealed behind the false wall. Ethan carefully inserted the brass key into the circular opening beneath the bronze letter B. For a brief moment nothing happened. Then a soft metallic click echoed through the hidden chamber, followed by the slow movement of an intricate locking mechanism that sounded unlike anything found in an ordinary garage. The thick steel door shifted only a few inches before stopping naturally, as though inviting respect rather than force. A cool breath of untouched air drifted outward, carrying the faint scent of aged wood, machine oil, and history preserved in silence. Ethan gently pulled the door open the rest of the way, while Liam aimed the flashlight into the darkness beyond. A narrow staircase descended beneath the garage, its sturdy concrete steps remarkably clean despite the passing decades. Along the walls hung vintage industrial lamps, now dark but perfectly intact. Ethan rested one hand lightly on Liam's shoulder. "We take this slowly. Some places deserve patience." Father and son descended together until the staircase opened into a spacious underground room. Rows of carefully arranged workbenches stood exactly as they had been left many years earlier. Precision tools rested inside neatly labeled drawers. Shelves displayed polished metal components protected beneath glass covers. Every object reflected extraordinary discipline and pride. Dust covered the surfaces, yet nothing appeared abandoned. Instead, it felt as though the owner had simply stepped away and expected to return one day. Near the center of the workshop rested a large oak drafting table where several rolled engineering drawings remained secure beneath brass weights. Beside them lay an aged leather journal, a framed black and white photograph of an older engineer standing proudly beside a prototype automobile and a small wooden case bearing the same engraved letter B. Ethan carefully lifted the photograph. Whoever built this place believed their work mattered. Before he could examine the journal more closely, footsteps echoed softly from the staircase above. Both Ethan and Liam turned as Victoria Bennett slowly entered the hidden workshop. She stopped several feet away, her eyes immediately filling with emotion as she looked around the room she had spent years hoping still existed. For a long silent moment, she could not speak. Then she quietly approached the photograph in Ethan's hands. "That is my grandfather," she said, her voice almost breaking. Ethan looked from the photograph to Victoria with calm surprise. She took a slow breath before continuing. "My name is Victoria Bennett. I'm a chief executive officer of Bennett Motors. My grandfather built this workshop in secret during the final years of his career. After he passed away, legal disputes buried every record connected to this property. I searched for it for 12 years. She lowered her eyes briefly before meeting Ethan's gaze once again. "Yesterday I came here hoping to buy the garage because I believe something important was hidden inside. I never expected someone like you to find it first." Ethan remained completely still before extending the photograph toward her without hesitation. "If this belongs to your family's history, then you should be the first to hold it again." Victoria accepted the frame carefully, visibly moved by a kindness she had not expected. Most people would have hidden the discovery or demanded answers before sharing anything. Ethan simply chose respect. Liam smiled quietly as he watched the exchange. Victoria looked around the workshop once more before her attention settled on the unopened wooden case resting beside the journal. A small brass plaque attached to its lid carried a simple inscription that none of them had noticed until now. It read, "The greatest invention is never a machine. It is the character of the person trusted to open what comes next." Victoria Bennett gently traced her fingertips across the worn brass plaque before carefully lifting the lid of the wooden case. The old hinges moved without resistance, almost as though they had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. Inside rested another polished brass key, several carefully folded engineering drawings secured with a faded ribbon, and a sealed envelope bearing her grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. The elegant script simply read, "For the person who chooses purpose before possession." The underground workshop became completely silent. Even Liam instinctively lowered his voice as Ethan respectfully stepped back, allowing Victoria the opportunity to open the envelope herself. Instead, she slowly turned toward him and quietly shook her head. "You found this place. You opened the hidden door. I think you should read it first." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "This belongs to your family." Victoria smiled softly, her eyes reflecting gratitude rather than ownership. "Perhaps, but my grandfather believed character mattered more than names. If he addressed the person who opened this workshop, then he was speaking to you." Ethan accepted the envelope carefully, making certain not to damage the fragile paper. He unfolded the letter with steady hands while Liam stood close beside him. The first lines were written with remarkable clarity despite the passing years. If you're reading these words, then you have already passed the first test. You respected what you did not understand. You opened this place with patience instead of force. Continue only if your heart values stewardship above ownership. Ethan paused for a long moment before quietly lowering the letter. The words felt less like instructions and more like wisdom earned through an entire lifetime. Victoria watched his expression carefully, realizing her grandfather had written exactly as she remembered him speaking. Never in a hurry, never impressed by wealth alone. Ethan carefully unfolded the engineering drawings resting beneath the letter. Spread across the drafting table appeared detailed plans for an extraordinary automotive prototype unlike anything he had ever repaired. Every measurement had been drawn with remarkable precision, accompanied by handwritten notes describing efficiency, durability, and mechanical simplicity rather than luxury. Ethan studied the pages with quiet admiration. Whoever designed this understood machines the way great musicians understand music. Victoria smiled through growing emotion. My grandfather believed engineering should improve ordinary lives, not simply create expensive products. She took a slow breath before looking directly at Ethan. I want to make you an offer. Ethan looked up from the drawings. Victoria spoke calmly, without arrogance or pressure. I will pay $5 million for this garage exactly as it stands. The property, everything inside it, every document. You will never have to worry about another bill for the rest of your life. Liam glanced toward his father, understanding the unimaginable size of the offer without fully grasping the number itself. $5 million could transform everything they had ever struggled through. Ethan remained completely still, his eyes returning to the letter still resting in his hands. After another quiet moment, he gently folded the paper closed. That is more money than I have ever imagined, he admitted honestly. But if I sold this today, without understanding why your grandfather hid it, I would spend the rest of my life wondering whether I traded away something that was never meant to be measured in dollars. Victoria stared at him in complete silence. During years of business negotiations, she had watched experienced executives abandon lifelong principles for far smaller amounts of money. Yet the mechanic standing before her declined a fortune with gratitude instead of pride. Rather than feeling disappointed, she found herself respecting him even more deeply. As Ethan carefully returned the letter to the drafting table, one final folded page that had remained hidden inside the envelope quietly slipped free and drifted onto the wooden floor. Across the top, written in the same careful handwriting, appeared a single sentence that immediately captured all three of their attention. The true inheritance has not yet been found. The newly discovered page rested quietly on the wooden floor until Liam carefully picked it up with both hands and passed it to Ethan. The old paper felt surprisingly strong despite the years, as though it had been protected with extraordinary care. Ethan unfolded it slowly while Victoria stood beside him, her breathing almost silent inside the hidden workshop. The familiar handwriting continued across the page with calm confidence. If you have reached this sentence, then you have already proven something far more valuable than intelligence. Wealth can purchase buildings. Knowledge can design machines. Only character can be trusted with a legacy. Ethan read each word aloud, allowing every sentence to settle naturally into the stillness surrounding them. The letter continued. Many people will search for what is hidden beneath this garage because they believe the greatest reward is ownership. They're mistaken. Stewardship has always been greater than ownership. A person who protects something for the benefit of others has already become richer than someone who merely possesses it. Victoria slowly lowered her eyes. Throughout her career, she had measured success through growth, acquisitions, and financial achievements. Standing inside her grandfather's forgotten workshop, those familiar measurements suddenly felt incomplete. Ethan folded the page halfway before continuing. If my granddaughter is standing beside you, I hope she has discovered that a family name alone is never enough. Respect must be earned again by every generation. Victoria closed her eyes for a brief moment as emotion quietly softened her expression. She remembered her grandfather repeating similar words when she was a little girl, always reminding her that a good reputation was borrowed from those who came before and preserved only through kindness toward those who came after. Liam looked from Ethan to Victoria before asking in his innocent voice, "Does that mean this place belongs to everyone who takes care of it?" Ethan smiled warmly. "I think it means nobody truly owns something this special. We simply become responsible for protecting it." Victoria nodded slowly. "That sounds exactly like something my grandfather would have wanted people to understand." She walked toward one of the carefully preserved workbenches where another framed photograph rested beneath a layer of dust. The picture showed her grandfather surrounded not by wealthy executives, but by young mechanics, apprentices, and ordinary factory workers, all smiling proudly beside unfinished automobiles. She gently cleaned the glass with her handkerchief. "He always believed great companies should begin by serving ordinary families," she whispered. Ethan looked around the remarkable workshop once more. The precision tools, handwritten journals, engineering models, and carefully organized shelves no longer felt like hidden treasures waiting to become expensive museum pieces. They felt like lessons patiently preserved for someone willing to understand them. As the afternoon light gradually faded above the garage, the underground room remained peacefully illuminated by portable work lights Ethan had brought downstairs. The quiet atmosphere seemed almost sacred, inviting reflection instead of celebration. Victoria turned toward Ethan with complete sincerity. "Yesterday, I came here believing I needed to recover my family's lost property. Today, I realize I came here to recover something much more important. I had forgotten why my grandfather built any of this in the first place." Ethan answered with the same humility that had guided every decision since purchasing the garage. Sometimes we spend years searching for a place when what we really need is the lesson waiting inside it. Victoria smiled gently, grateful not because she had found the workshop, but because she had found someone willing to share it without demanding anything in return. As Ethan carefully placed the letter back inside the wooden case, his hand brushed against one corner of the drafting table. A quiet mechanical click echoed through the workshop. All three of them instinctively looked toward the far brick wall, where a narrow section slowly shifted outward by only a few inches, revealing the edge of another hidden compartment that none of them had noticed before. The narrow section of brick moved only far enough to reveal a slim compartment hidden inside the wall, and for several quiet seconds no one spoke. Ethan Carter slowly approached, careful not to disturb the mechanism that had remained untouched for decades. Inside rested a long metal cylinder wrapped in aged leather along with a single folded blueprint protected inside a brass tube. Ethan lifted both items gently onto the drafting table while Victoria Bennett watched with growing anticipation. Liam stood beside them, his eyes wide with wonder as though each discovery answered one question while creating two more. Ethan carefully unrolled the leather covering and revealed another handwritten blueprint unlike any they had examined before. Across the top, Samuel Bennett had written one simple sentence: "The final answer cannot be drawn. It must be understood." Ethan studied every line with the focused attention of a mechanic who had spent nearly 2 decades solving problems that diagrams alone could never explain. The drawing appeared incomplete. Certain measurements stopped unexpectedly. Several mechanical connections simply ended without explanation. Victoria leaned closer. "That cannot be right. My grandfather never left unfinished work." Ethan slowly shook his head. "I do not think it is unfinished. I think he intentionally left something out." Before anyone could examine the blueprint further, the peaceful silence was interrupted by the sound of several vehicles pulling into the parking lot above. Heavy tires rolled across loose gravel before engines quietly shut down one after another. Ethan looked toward the staircase. "We have visitors." Moments later, a sharply dressed man descended into the hidden workshop accompanied by 2 professionally dressed assistants carrying leather portfolios. He paused halfway down the stairs, clearly impressed by what he saw before continuing with a confident smile. "My name is Richard Lawson," he said politely while extending his hand. I apologize for arriving without an appointment. Ethan returned the handshake calmly. Richard glanced around the remarkable underground workshop before speaking again. I represent investors who are preparing a major redevelopment project for this entire neighborhood. Your property happens to sit at the center of that plan. Victoria quietly recognized his name immediately. Richard Lawson had earned a national reputation by purchasing aging industrial districts and transforming them into profitable commercial developments. He always arrived with generous offers and carefully prepared contracts. Richard placed a thick folder on the drafting table without looking at the documents already spread across it. I understand someone has already made an offer for this garage. I would like to improve upon it. Ethan remained silent. Richard smiled confidently. $10 million. Cash. We purchased the property exactly as it stands. You walk away financially secure. We handle everything else. Liam looked toward his father, but saw no excitement, only quiet reflection. Victoria stepped forward before Ethan answered. Richard, this workshop represents an important part of American engineering history. It should be preserved. Richard smiled politely. History is valuable when displayed properly inside modern facilities. We can build a museum after redevelopment is complete. Ethan gently folded the blueprint before looking directly at Richard. What happens to this garage? Richard answered honestly. The existing structure would be removed. The land itself is considerably more valuable than the building. Ethan glanced around the workshop one more time. The carefully organized tools, the handwritten journals, the patient wisdom preserved in Samuel Bennett's letters, and Liam standing quietly beside him all seemed to answer before he spoke. I appreciate your offer, Ethan said with complete respect. But some places become valuable because of what they teach people, not because of what can be built on top of them. Richard studied Ethan for several silent seconds, almost unable to believe another enormous offer had been declined without negotiation. Victoria slowly smiled, no longer standing across from Ethan as a wealthy business leader, but beside him as someone who finally understood her grandfather's vision. As Richard gathered his folder and prepared to leave, his eyes briefly fell upon the incomplete blueprint resting on the table. Interesting drawing, he remarked casually. It looks like something important is missing. After he disappeared up the staircase, Ethan unfolded the blueprint once more. Near the lower corner, where everyone had previously focused on the missing measurements, Liam quietly pointed toward a tiny handwritten note almost hidden inside the margin. It read, "Only the hands that repair without seeking reward will discover what the missing line truly means." Ethan Carter read the tiny handwritten note several more times before carefully placing the blueprint flat across the drafting table. The words refused to leave his mind. Only the hands that repair without seeking reward will discover what the missing line truly means. Victoria Bennett examined every measurement once again, comparing the incomplete drawing with the earlier engineering plans they had already uncovered. Nothing appeared obviously wrong, yet something undeniably remained unfinished. Liam quietly walked around the workshop, studying the preserved tools with the curiosity only a child could bring. Maybe your grandfather wanted somebody to figure it out instead of simply reading it, he said. Ethan smiled gently. I think you might be right. He stepped toward the partially assembled prototype resting beneath a protective canvas at the far end of the workshop. Carefully pulling the cover aside revealed an elegant engine unlike any he had ever seen. Every component reflected remarkable craftsmanship, yet Ethan immediately noticed something unusual. He circled the machine slowly, occasionally kneeling to examine small details before standing again. Victoria watched him with growing curiosity. What do you see? Ethan pointed toward a polished brass regulator mounted beside the main housing. According to the blueprint, this part should connect directly here. He paused before lightly touching the surrounding brackets. But whoever assembled this engine connected it differently. Victoria frowned. Then either the blueprint is wrong or the engine was never completed. Ethan slowly shook his head. Your grandfather built too carefully to make that kind of mistake. He reached for one of the journals lying open nearby and compared its sketches with the engine itself. Every drawing repeated the same missing connection. Then Ethan smiled quietly. Now I understand. Victoria stepped closer. Understand what? Ethan looked toward the incomplete blueprint. The missing line was never forgotten. Your grandfather intentionally refused to draw it because he wanted the builder to discover it through experience instead of copying instructions. He carefully loosened the brass regulator and rotated it only a few inches before securing it into a slightly different position. The adjustment appeared almost insignificant, yet every angle suddenly aligned naturally with the surrounding components. Liam's eyes widened. How did you know? Ethan laughed softly. After repairing thousands of engines, you stop looking only at what should fit. You begin listening to what wants to fit. Victoria remained completely silent as Ethan continued making several careful adjustments guided not by guesswork, but by years of practical knowledge earned through honest work. Nothing about his movements appeared rushed. Every bolt received equal attention. Every connection reflected patience instead of pride. Finally, he stepped back and looked toward Victoria. Would you like to do the honors? She hesitated before placing her hand gently upon the old ignition switch mounted beside the prototype. My grandfather always believed machines deserved respect, she whispered. Ethan nodded. Then start it with respect. Victoria slowly turned the switch. For one quiet heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the engine answered with a smooth, steady rhythm unlike the rough sound of ordinary machinery. There was no violent roar, only a calm mechanical harmony that filled the underground workshop with quiet life after decades of silence. Liam broke into a joyful smile, while Ethan simply closed his eyes for a brief moment, listening carefully. That is one of the smoothest engines I have ever heard, he said. Victoria looked toward him with tears quietly gathering in her eyes. All these years, I believe my grandfather had hidden a great invention. Ethan smiled warmly. He did. But the invention was never only this engine. It was the lesson that experience, humility, and character complete what blueprints alone never can. Victoria slowly looked around the workshop once more. The letters, the hidden rooms, the unfinished drawings, and every test along the way suddenly formed one complete story. Her grandfather had never been searching for the wealthiest heir. He had been waiting for the right steward. As the engine continued its calm, steady rhythm, a neatly sealed envelope resting unnoticed behind the prototype slipped gently onto the floor, bearing one final handwritten message across the front. When the engine breathes again, the future may finally begin. The sealed envelope rested quietly beside the smoothly running engine until Ethan Carter picked it up with the same careful hands that had restored countless ordinary vehicles throughout his life. The paper carried the familiar handwriting of Samuel Bennett, and beneath the simple message on the front appeared one final sentence. Please read these words only after the engine lives again. Ethan gently opened the envelope while Victoria Bennett and Liam stood beside him in complete silence. The workshop seemed almost peaceful enough to hear every heartbeat as Ethan began reading aloud. To the person standing here today, if this engine has awakened once more, then my greatest hope has already become reality. You did not arrive because you were the richest. You did not succeed because you were the smartest. You arrived because you chose patience over pride, service over ownership, and people over profit. Every invention inside this workshop belongs not to one family, but to every honest pair of hands willing to use knowledge for the good of others. Ethan paused for a moment before continuing. My granddaughter, if you are here, remember that leadership is never measured by what you possess. It is measured by what continues to bless others long after your own name is forgotten. Victoria quietly wiped away a tear before smiling with gratitude instead of sadness. She finally understood that her grandfather had never hidden this workshop to protect his inventions from the world. He had protected them until the right people found them together. 6 months passed. Quietly, and the abandoned garage that had once attracted laughter slowly became one of the most respected places in the county. The weathered brick walls were carefully restored without changing their original character. Fresh paint covered old scars, while every historic detail remained preserved with care. The underground workshop continued operating exactly as Samuel Bennett intended, not as a private museum, but as a place where experienced mechanics volunteered their time, teaching young apprentices practical skills, patience, and integrity. Every Saturday morning, families gathered inside the restored garage, while veterans, retired technicians, and students worked side by side on community projects. Bennett Motors provided funding for equipment, scholarships, and educational programs, yet Victoria insisted that no corporate logos appear anywhere inside the building. A simple wooden sign hung above the entrance instead. It read, "Stewardship before ownership." Richard Lawson quietly withdrew his redevelopment proposal after realizing neither Ethan nor Victoria would compromise the purpose of the property regardless of how much money was offered. Without conflict or celebration, the neighborhood continued growing around the garage instead of replacing it. One crisp autumn afternoon, the community gathered for a small dedication ceremony. There were no expensive stages, no flashing cameras, and no speeches celebrating personal success. Ethan stood near the entrance wearing the same faded blue work shirt he had worn on the day he purchased the abandoned building. Liam now proudly helped younger children organize tools inside the training area, smiling each time someone learned a new skill. Victoria walked over and handed Ethan the original brass key that had opened the hidden workshop months earlier. "I think this belongs with the person who understands what it truly opens," she said softly. Ethan looked at the polished key before gently closing her hand around it once again. "No," he answered with a warm smile. "It belongs with the people who promise to keep opening doors for someone else." Victoria nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. As the afternoon, sunlight filled the restored garage with warm golden light. The gentle sound of apprentices learning, families laughing, and engines being repaired echoed through the building that everyone had once dismissed as worthless. The greatest inheritance had never been hidden behind a wall, locked inside a workshop, or preserved within remarkable engineering drawings. It had always lived inside quiet dignity, humble hands willing to serve, and ordinary people choosing character before wealth, proving that the most valuable legacy any person leaves behind is not what they own, but the lives they help rebuild.